Hello everyone, this is Pico Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we have another video for you, and this will be a review of Batman The Long Halloween Part 1. This is the latest feature-length DC animated movie, and it is based on a revered comic book storyline created by Jeff Loeb, and it ran for 13 issues published from 1996 to 1997. Now, the story itself will be adapted in two parts, with Part 1 being released on June the 22nd, 2021, and Part 2 coming literally a month later on July the 27th, 2021. Now, the setup of Batman The Long Halloween is that we follow a prime Batman set within Gotham City, of course, and he works together with Commissioner Gordon and attorney Harvey Dent to take down the major Falcone crime organisation. They're also trying to find a killer who is taking down various criminal figures on specific holidays throughout the year. Now, in terms of this story, we essentially get an early Harvey Dent origin. We seemingly get a prime Batman in terms of his fighting skills and physical capabilities, but he isn't quite the detective that we associate so much from the character within all of fandom, and the movie constantly reminds us of that. We have certain quotes from both Gordon and Dent constantly reminding Batman that he's still got some way to go before fully realising his detective skills. But this is not an origin story in the likes of Batman Year One at all. This is still very much a Batman who is very much established as the city's protector. This is much more of a murder mystery narrative as opposed to a more typical comic book spectacular action-packed adventure. It's very much of a more grounded, realistic take, and it wouldn't surprise me if the upcoming Batman movie starring Robert Pattinson and Matt Reeves takes a similar tone in terms of grounding down and really avoiding the more fantasy elements that we've seen in previous Batman adaptations. Now, overall, to be honest, this is a decent, average and slightly underwhelming and a bit disappointing for me adaptation, given all the hype surrounding both the release and the comic book storyline. It moves along at a measured pace and it has that mature tone, very similar in terms of a police procedural. Yes, it's an adult orientated tone, but it's far less R-rated than previous Batman entries in terms of violence and language. There are some interesting character elements within the story, but as the plot moves on, it eventually covers all too much familiar ground and descends into confrontations and climaxes that we've seen previously so much throughout various Batman stories. Now, we do get appearances of various classic villains throughout the story without spoiling it too much, but some of those appearances don't really feel necessary to the plot overall, and you could have quite easily taken them out of this particular movie and it wouldn't have had any impact in terms of the overall plot. The animation, as usual, is very well produced. It moves very smoothly, a nice frame rate going on there, and of course it looks very good and shiny and glossy in HD. It does adapt very much the same thick, bold, heavy lineup than what we've seen previously from both Superman, Man from Tomorrow and Justice Society World War II as well. From a personal perspective, I'm not a huge fan of this art style, and I find it very telling that following the conclusion of the New 52 continuity, which we saw in Justice League Dark Apocalypse, we were promised that each of these animated films are going to very much have their own style in terms of their look and aesthetic, but that's not what I'm seeing recently. A lot of them share that same animation style overall, so I would hope maybe in Batman The Long Halloween Part 2 and future productions after that we can really go back to getting far more distinctive art style in terms of how the characters are drawn. The voice work itself is fine, very well, it's very well performed, so no problems here in terms of the voice performances from the actors. In terms of action, it's very lacking, I would say, apart from one very good spectacular fight scene where Batman encounters a certain amount of assassins, and it's very well staged, it's very well executed, but again, those moments are very few and far in between, and the movie itself can seem to drag at certain points. It's a bit prolonged. I look back on this movie and it's around about an hour and 20 minutes runtime. It could have easily been 60 minutes when I look at the plot points overall, and it wouldn't have been a worse off movie for it. I will give credit to the fact that it doesn't rely so much on a constant use of musical score as what we've seen primarily through so many previous animated movies, and also with the Christopher Nolan Dark Knight films, in particular both The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises. We get multiple scenes throughout where there is no musical score, so I think they did that on purpose to try and give it much more of a realistic edge to this film. And as I mentioned before, this is clearly the direction that they've gone for. Now again, it may seem more grounded and maybe more believable in terms of a Batman story, but it really lacks that comic book flavour, that comic book distinctiveness that I've commented on previous videos, especially when I covered the Tim Burton movies and the Batman the Animated Series, where they really made Gotham this much more of this otherworldly place, this distinctive environment that only Batman can perform in and take on these villains. And I'm not as much of a fan when we strip that away and we go for much more of this real life environment. I just think it takes away a lot of the potential that we can get in Batman stories overall, and I think Batman The Long Halloween Part 1 suffers from this as well. There's just not enough there in terms of energy, pace, exhilaration to really keep you compelled throughout the entire movie overall. So if I had to give a score for Batman The Long Halloween Part 1, I would give it a 5.8 out of 10. As I mentioned before, it's very sound, very well polished and produced, but it lacks really any truly exceptional moments to really make this stand out from the huge clutch of Batman animated films that we continue to get throughout the years. Now, as I mentioned before, we will be getting part 2 later on in July this year, and part 1 just feels more like a setup for presumably part 2, which will be far more interesting. Now, many people may counter some of the criticisms that I've put on this review and say, well, it's like this because part 1 is just a build up, it's just a setup for part 2. But for me, I don't think that's good enough. I think if you have a movie that really can't be completed until we see part 2, then I think that's something where the first film has failed. The first film should be its own complete story. It shouldn't need to rely on a part 2 before we can judge it completely on its own. So when I look back on this, I kind of feel that we could have perhaps had this condensed to an hour, as I mentioned before, or indeed taken much more of a shorter story for part 1, put it on to part 2, and we could have had a longer single movie, maybe an hour and 50 minutes or even 2 hours, and that might have resulted in a much better result overall. Again, I can't really confirm this until I review part 2, so we will wait and see how part 2 plays out. There is an end credit scene at the end which does play very much into what we will see in part 2, and again gives me far more enthusiasm to what we should surely get in a much more interesting and a much more immersive second installment. So those are my thoughts and feelings and review on Batman The Long Halloween Part 1. Let me know what you think in the comments below. How do you feel it compares to previous animated efforts that we've seen within DC? In terms of my opinion, it's nowhere near as good as Under the Red Hood or Dark Knight Returns, but it is better than both The Killing Joke and Batman Ninja as well. So it depends on where you are in terms of what you feel is the best in terms of the DC animated Batman movies. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Are you still excited for part 2? Would you like to see a drastic change in the animation style for these animated movies? Would you like to see to much more adapt the art style from the comics, which is what I would like to see personally as well? Or are you a major fan of the Bruce Timm, Paul Dini art style from the iconic Batman the Animated Series, and you look to see them adopt more of that style as well? So let me know what you think in the comments below. Please also hit and like those subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.